It's time now for some analysis from our political panel. Phil Rucker is a White House bureau chief at the Washington Post, and he has a new book out, along with his colleague Carol Leonnig, A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. David Nakamura also covers the White House for the Washington Post. Ramesh Ponnuru is senior editor at the National Review and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. And Kelsey Snell is a congressional correspondent at NPR. Kelsey, start us off here. What can we expect? Will this trial go beyond next week?
I've been told that the absolute fastest it could end would be Friday. So the White House still has to, they have 2 days left that they could use to make their argument. We understand that they don't plan to use the totality of that time. And then senators will have time to ask questions. They will not be standing up and speaking their questions. They will all be written and passed forward. And then the question of witnesses and evidence comes up. I've been told that Friday is a quick pace, but it's the pace that they hope to meet because there's a lot at stake here. You've got the Iowa caucuses next week. You have State of the Union next week, and the president has an interview during the Super Bowl. So there is a great interest among Republicans in wrapping this up by the end of the week.
Senator Cotton said he couldn't or wouldn't forecast votes on witnesses. Do you have the sense that there are 4 Republicans lined up to vote to approve them?
A Republican aide told me that the votes weren't there on Tuesday and they weren't there last night, and they don't expect the votes to be there next week. So there is some confidence among Republicans that Democrats simply have not convinced 4 Republicans to move to their side.
Ramesh, what is the risk in casting that vote? Is there one?
Well, the polls do indicate that most people think that there should be witnesses. But I think that Republicans are on the assumption that their voters, Republican-based voters, have basically concluded that this is, as the president says, a scam and a witch hunt, and that there's plenty of time between now and the election. This is not going to be the top voting issue.
But for what is not known, for the recordings like we now have, the things that continue to dribble out, is there a risk in casting a vote, not approving witnesses, and then being surprised down the line that more evidence comes out that makes it look like maybe you should have asked more questions?
I'm not sure that a lot of the senators are thinking that far ahead. I think what they are thinking is they've got to stand with the party, that this is a time for party unity. And one of the things we're seeing that structured this whole debate is that 2/3 requirement in the Senate to remove a president. Yeah. It requires so much consensus in the country. And when you don't have a very, very significant part of the president's own party willing to do that, it's preordained that it's not going to go anywhere.
So, David, the president is being teed up to essentially say he was vindicated, and Republicans seem confident that they've won. Absolutely. Is that where the president's head is at right now?
Certainly. I mean, he's concerned about what's happening here, but he certainly is hoping to set that up and be able to sort of announce that at the State of the Union. Similar to the way he did with the Russia investigation and calling it a witch hunt for so long. Once that was over, he said, I'm clean, I'm done with this, we're moving on. And certainly he and his advisors see it that way. I think they would like to, as much as the president at times has vacillated and suggested that he'd like to see some witnesses, particularly Democratic witnesses as well, such as Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. I think in the end, he will take the cues from Mitch McConnell in the Senate, and I think he probably would be fine if it moves quickly.
Phil, I pressed Congressman Crow on whether Democrats had overplayed their hand and referenced some of the language that has offended Republicans. Yeah. The president just this morning has tweeted something about Adam Schiff, saying he has not paid the price yet for what he has done to our country. The other day, he called him a liar, a cheat. He's called other Democratic leaders dumb as rocks. It doesn't seem to be offensive that the president is calling Democratic leaders there, but Republicans are taking offense at some of the language Democrats are using on the floor of the Senate.
Yeah, I think, Margaret, there are a couple reasons for that. First of all, this is a president who demands absolute fealty from Republicans in Congress and especially in the Senate right now, and has threatened them, and they feel threatened. And so there's just a reluctance among these Republicans to cross Trump in any way, including calling him out for the tweets that you just mentioned. And, the president feels this sense of victimization. He has these grievances. He feels like anybody who's trying to hold him accountable in our system of government, including in the legislative branch, is somehow violating him violating the American people, trying to undo the 2016 election. This is the way the president views all of this that's going on, and I think that's one of the reasons we've seen him use such extraordinarily harsh language in his Twitter comments.
And you also don't expect for Republicans to vote alongside Democrats to approve witnesses? This is, in other words, a successful strategy?
It appears to be. Certainly 4 Republicans could vote. We already see Mitt Romney suggesting he might. It would only require 3 more. They could get there. But again, the Republicans are really cowed at this point and unwilling to cross the president.
Kelsey, Democrats are arguing that all of this entire impeachment investigation was about preserving the integrity of the U.S. elections. But then we also heard from Chairman Schiff that he thinks the elections in 2020 may not be unencumbered by some kind of interference. That kind of seems at cross purposes messaging wise. What does all of this leave the American people with? What do they walk away from impeachment thinking?
Well, I think that's part of why we saw, particularly during prime time, that Adam Schiff was speaking less to the senators in the room. There was a different feeling to the way he spoke. He was presenting the case in a much more concise and direct way to the voters, talking to them about what's at stake, not just in the presidential election, but I think there was a lot of talk about what was at stake for the Senate and these senators who will be voting to acquit or to convict this president or to oust this president. I think a lot of what Schiff is trying to do is drive the stakes home and make people feel engaged in 2020 in a way that they may not already.
Phil, in your book, you and Carol write about one particular instance that caught my attention where President Trump was saying he would like to try to repeal the prohibition against paying bribes to foreign leaders. Essentially, that's corruption. We've heard a lot about corruption and the president's concern about stamping it out in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So from your reporting, have you seen a broader concern in stamping it out? Because that one particular incident you write about seems at odds.
There is no broader concern that we were able to detect in our reporting, and we interviewed, by the way, more than 200 Trump administration officials and advisors to the president for this book. And there's a common thread, which is that this is a president who doesn't really care about corruption, either abroad or in his businesses or in his administration. He cares about winning. He cares about advancing his personal agenda, building the self-image that he has created for himself according to the people who've worked closest to him. And that's at odds with the argument that his lawyers are making in this impeachment trial, which is that Trump was so fixated on ending corruption in Ukraine and investigating corruption in Ukraine. In fact, he asked Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in 2017 to end the law, to repeal the law in America that prohibited that sort of foreign corruption.
Which is shocking.
It was very surprising to us when we heard about it. And in fact, once our book came out a few days ago, one of the president's top advisors confirmed publicly that the president is interested in getting rid of this law. He just does not have the power to do so on his own because, of course, we have a legislative branch in this country.
Larry Kudlow is who you're referring to.
That's
there.
correct.
Said yes, it had been discussed. David, meanwhile, this coming week, in addition to impeachment, we have a few other newsy events, including the president is planning, I don't know, do we call it a summit? Certainly an invitation to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, himself facing some legal problems, indicted back at home, fighting for his political life, along with his political rival.
This looks, yeah.
What is this about?
Well, this looks like a big moment for a couple things. One is the president does like to counter-program to what's happening in Congress. He went out last week and became the first sitting president to visit the March for Life, and he sort of rallied tens of thousands of mostly supporters, some of whom were wearing campaign clothing, and sort of had a split-screen image to what was happening. So part of it's that, but he's also now announcing that he's going to lay out his long anticipated Middle East peace plan. As these Israeli leaders are here. This is something that the administration's been working on with Jared Kushner and others for a long time. However, it appears to be essentially dead on arrival in that the president has had such close bonds with the Israeli leadership, the Palestinians have not bought into it. So you're going to see the president sort of doing these kind of things next week. There's also a signing of the trade deal with Mexico and Canada. The president's going to do to sort of take back some of the headlines. But he's often his own worst enemy when he begins tweeting about what's happening on the Hill.
Now, I want to ask both you, Kelsey and Ramesh, to weigh in on something, but I want to set it up for our viewers here. Secretary Pompeo made clear he does not like being asked questions about Ukraine, some of which one of your colleagues at NPR, Mary Louise Kelly, put to him this week. I want to play her account of what happened after the interview.
I was taken to the secretary's private living room where he was waiting and where he shouted at me for about the same amount of time as the interview itself had lasted. He was not happy to have been questioned about Ukraine. He asked, "Do you think Americans care about Ukraine?" He used the F word in that sentence and many others. He asked if I could find Ukraine on a map. I said yes. He called out for his aides to bring him a map of the world with no rating, no countries marked. I pointed to Ukraine. He put the map away. He said, "People will hear about this." And then he turned and said he had things to do. And I thanked him again for his time and left.
The secretary issued a statement officially from the State Department, calling your colleague a liar, attacking her integrity, her journalism, her sense of geography, among other things. Tell me about what happened.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that Mary Louise is a great journalist and somebody whose integrity I've never seen questioned before. She works incredibly hard and is always incredibly prepared. I think it's important to note that in his statement, Secretary Pompeo never disputes the facts that are reported in the entirety of the questioning. We aired her interview unedited. And he never disputes any of the facts there. And there is a chain of emails. Mary Louise has told our CEO and has shared with the folks higher up at NPR a chain of emails where she establishes that she plans to talk to the secretary about Ukraine. As a network, we fully stand behind her.
Ramesh, you know, it's not unusual to see the Trump administration butt heads with reporters. But this, issuing a statement from the State Department, which normally advocates for press freedom around the world. Do you see a broader impact to this?
Well, I think there has been a real dramatic acceleration of the Republican Party's war on the press, in the sense that there is now no limit to how much bashing of the press a Republican feels can be in their political interest. There's no sense that Republican voters are going to say, well, that's really a little bit too far.
Maybe true, but you think for the Secretary of State, I think, Margaret, like you're talking about, he's talking about places like China, others that squash freedoms. President Trump has not spoken out so broadly, but certainly Pompeo and others have spoken about the demonstrations in Hong Kong. President is certainly talking about demonstrators in Iran having free speech. For the top diplomat to do this, I think he seemed to show real frustration, whereas other cases maybe a little bit of a show.
And to be clear, the question was specifically about the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who's at the center of the impeachment probe. We'll be right back.